Greetings. Welcome to our presentation titled Different Paths to Decoding the Disciplines, Reflections on the Disrupting Interview and Use, which was originally presented at the ISSOTL 2021 online conference. Before we get started on our presentation, I'd just like to take a moment to introduce myself, and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues and they will introduce themselves as well. So, greetings, my name is Gabrielle Lindstrom. My Blackfoot name is Sabinaki. That name was gifted to me by my father when I graduated with my master's degree. I'm an educational development consultant in Indigenous ways of knowing at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. I'm also a member of the Kainai First Nation, also known as the Blood Tribe, which is part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the original territories of my people that I'm speaking to you from, as well as honor the people of Treaty 7. So the people of Treaty 7 include the Blackfoot Confederacy, which are the Kainai, the Siksika, the Piikani, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, which include Chiniki, Wesley, and Bearspaw. This territory is also home to Métis Nation Region 3. So I'd also like to acknowledge that my ancestors have called these territories home for thousands of years. So I'm deeply honored to be able to acknowledge that. And I'll just hand it over to Robin.
Thanks, Gabe. My name is Robin Addis. I'm an educational developer at the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning at the University of Manitoba in Manitoba, Canada. Both the University of Manitoba and my home, which I'm speaking to you from today, are located on Treaty 1, which is considered to be the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and also the homeland of the Métis Nation. And when I make a land acknowledgement, I really think about my own position in relation to that history and in relation to the peoples that have lived and continue to live on this land, and in relation to the land itself. And I'll pass it to Michelle.
Hello, I'm Michelle Yeo. I'm director of the Kuokkanen Center for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta, in Canada. I'm a white settler scholar living and working here in Treaty 7, like Gabe. And I would like to acknowledge my obligations to the land and to this place. And I think when I do land acknowledgement, I think about where my family is from in Saskatchewan, and how my family came from Europe and settled in Treaty 6 territory on land that, you know, they perceived as being empty for the taking, and farmed there, which was not. So I'll pass it over to Lee.
Thanks, Michelle. My name is Easton. I am a queer white settler scholar living and working in the Treaty 7 territories. I also think about the land and our relationship to it, and how important it is that we recognize the mutual sustaining relationship that exists between us and the land. I also think about the treaties, and I am always aware that not all the obligations of the treaties have been observed, and that we always must consider the circumstances and conditions that lack of observance has created for Indigenous peoples and our own involvement in creating those conditions. And I'm going to turn it over to Joan now.
Hi, I'm Joan Middendorf. I'm an adjunct professor in educational leadership at Indiana University, and I live and work on land that is in Indiana, which is ironically land of the Indians, though Indiana removed the Potawatomi Indians as long ago as 1846 and never honored any of the treaties. So I want to acknowledge and honor the Delaware, Shawnee, Miami, and Potawatomi people who did live in Indiana till we pushed them out, and we can continue to learn and benefit from what they're teaching us. So I think we're going to go on with the presentation now.
Yes, and just to give a quick overview of how this will be structured, we've got 3 parts to the presentation, and you'll see that there's a little graphic of a wreath that will separate each of the parts. So feel free to use that as kind of a benchmark that you can fast forward and watch just specific parts or watch through the whole thing, however you choose. So with that, I will pass it off to the group leading part 1.
Okay, so I'll begin. This part 1 will be 3 of us speaking that are located in Calgary, and as you've heard, this panel, as it was originally set up, represents 3 geographical locations and contexts. 3 of us from Alberta, 1 from Manitoba in Canada, and Joan in Indiana in the US. And so these 3 geographical locations and contexts are different and bring different needs, issues, and requirements to the work. So I'm just going to talk a little bit very briefly about how the project started and then expanded. And really for us, it began with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, the report that was published in 2015 with 94 calls to action. And some of these calls to action directly invoked tasks and obligations for education, both in the K-12 sector and in higher education. And really a conversation began in earnest in post-secondaries across Canada about decolonizing and indigenizing. This process has been challenging in so many ways, in large part because universities are deeply colonial places. The whole structure of how the university operates, who it's for, who gets to be there, all of these things have been exclusionary and based on Western knowledge systems. And so to decolonize that system is not a simple task, and it also requires a huge amount of commitment and a lot of soul searching, I think, on the part of people that work in those institutions. And it needs to happen at all levels of the institution. We sometimes talk about the micro, the meso, the macro level of the institution. So whether it's at a policy level, at a classroom level, and certainly it requires a lot of individual work as well. And I think the position of the place that we're working in this project is partly at, or largely at, that micro level, understanding that until people start to change how they understand disciplines, the work that they're doing, their relationship to Indigenous people and to the land, that nothing will change. So some of us had been at the same time or previously working with Decoding the Disciplines as kind of a separate track, which is Joan will talk, who's one of the originators of the process. So we're fortunate to have her here. She'll talk a little bit more about that. But just at a high level, Decoding the Disciplines engages the teacher in uncovering tacit knowledge within their discipline in an effort to make that more clear and explicit to their students. We started to see that this process could be used to uncover the colonial assumptions within academic disciplines. And so we started to really kind of experiment with what we call a disrupting interview. to help faculty members or and other interested people at the university to unpack the way that their disciplines are structured in an effort to create different kinds of openings and ask different questions in their classrooms. So, so we have 3 adaptations of this process at these 3 different sites. But first I'll turn over to Lee to talk a little bit more theoretically about what we're doing.
Thanks, Michelle. And as Michelle said, we were very interested in the Decoding the Disciplines approach, but we wanted in our thinking, first of all, to work with a couple of assumptions that we would take as a starting place. As Michelle mentioned, we see decolonization occurring at all levels in post-secondary education, whether that's the macro level of the institution, the field of post-secondary education, the micro, the classroom, the syllabus, or that middle level, which is, you know, maybe the department level or perhaps the faculty, capital F. We assume that disciplinary knowledges that we come to know and understand in North American context is imbricated with colonialism, and that if we're going to indigenize our disciplines, we're going to really have to question our most fundamental foundational assumptions if we're going to really engage with indigenization. And for us, on a theoretical level, we see the decoding the disciplines approach as a way to link the sort of meso level, the middle level of the discipline and of the department with the micro, with the classroom, and the teaching that happens within there, and that the teacher then becomes a kind of nexus point that we can engage with as we start to think about how do we disrupt our disciplines and not only decode them. So our process really moves away from the focus on the tacit knowledges of the teacher to the silent assumptions that the discipline holds about what's important for students to know and for the in order for them to become students or masters of the discipline. So what the disrupting interview really does is it stages an encounter between the teacher and the discipline's knowledge. We ask, why is a particular concept important for students to learn and to learn it in this way? We know that colonialism erases indigenous knowledges, and so one of the things that we have found very useful is the idea of the null curriculum, that which is not taught, that which is ignored or simply not even a consideration. So for us, then, we ask ourselves, what is taught, what's not taught, and crucially, why? And what we find is that when we start to probe an interviewee with these kinds of questions, that we continue to ask those questions in a way to push them to a moment that is kind of an impasse. It's a place where they can't really see right beyond where they're at. And it really is a kind of moment of soul searching. And for us, this is an important moment because it brings into view what we call the ethical space. And I'm going to turn it over to Gabrielle right now to talk a bit about that ethical space and how it works.
Thank you for that, Lee and Michelle. So I'm going to talk, as Lee mentioned, a little bit more about the ethical space, and I'll try to be as brief as I can, but there's some big ideas that underlie that. So what is the ethical space? So the ethical space, it's a theoretical concept that was first coined by ethicist Roger Poole and then later repurposed by Cree scholar Willie Ermine, and it refers to a theoretical space that opens up when two divergent thought systems meet. So this space is hidden and only accessed through dialogue, which then reveals assumptions and biases and offers the potential of transformed perspective. So why is it important? Why is the ethical space important to what we're doing? Because It is, because at the most basic level, engaging in the ethical space allows us to confront the historical and contemporary relationships between settler society and Indigenous peoples within this critical and anti-colonial theoretical construct, this theoretical space. So it also offers a framework within which we can start to analyze challenges and envision opportunities in ways that would advance mutual interests based on shared understandings and really a willingness to find some common ground to engage in meaningful dialogue. So what does the ethical space do? It acts as this theoretical point of reference that really has helped us to illuminate these hidden undercurrents of thought, or as Willie Ermine puts it, the enfolded dimension that needs to be acknowledged and brought to bear. So the ethical space is necessary for meaningful engagement and honest human-to-human dialogue to occur. And really, again, it's about revealing, allowing faculty who are engaging in our disrupting interview to think about their individual biases and assumptions. So when they're pushed, when they reach that impasse, that's when the ethical space is really opened up, and participants can oftentimes they have this aha moment, and where biases and assumptions, they can see how these might unconsciously influence how they enact their disciplinary knowledge in ways that may perpetuate colonial ideologies. So what does disrupting interview look like then in the ethical space? So oftentimes the faculty members who are in these disrupting interviews, they sit in discomfort. So it's really, we try to encourage sort of this getting comfortable with being discomforted. In the ethical space, the interview will illuminate colonial ideologies. The disrupting interview within the ethical space will provide safety to talk about unsafe topics like racism, like these colonial biases. It offers an opportunity to dialogue about faculty disciplinary perspectives and the connection to colonization, and encourages faculty to be objective about themselves and their own thinking. So it's really about the outside looking in at self. And so we've got some reflective questions here that will hopefully help you think more deeply about these responsibilities and your responsibilities as perhaps you work to decolonize your practice, your teaching practice. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Robin to talk about her work.
So in my section, I'm going to talk about an adaptation to the disrupting interview that I developed along with my friend and colleague, Algonquin-Métis traditional knowledge keeper, Tim Yerington, or Gray Thunderbird. And we worked on this in Cataraqui or Kingston when I was employed by the Queen's University Center for Teaching and Learning. And just a note that Tim chose not to be part of this presentation, but I've been trying hard to weave his perspectives in as I'm able throughout this talk. So if I could get the next slide, please. In 2019, Tim and I were fortunate to receive an Educational Developers Caucus grant for exchanges that gave us the funds to travel to Mohkinstsis, Calgary, to learn about the disrupting interview from Michelle and Gabe and Lee, as well as their colleague Roberta, who wasn't part of this particular presentation. And so over 4 days, the group of us experienced a lot, and we talk about that in more depth in a 2021 article in Transformative Dialogues. But there's two key revelations that came out of that for Tim and I. The first one was a sense that the disrupting disrupting interview was powerful, but that it was still rooted in Western colonial locations and ways of knowing. And the second was that we were profoundly impacted, both the two of us and I think the whole group, by the deep power of learning from and with the land. So as you can see here, this is a segment of the Bow River, sort of southeast of Calgary, where we went on the second day, our second day together, to try to find a 5,000-year-old medicine wheel on traditional Blackfoot territory. And so that contrast for us between day one in a university setting, in an office setting, and then day two out in this space, really led Tim and I to seek a way to bring a land-based disruption into the disrupting interview process. Land-based pedagogies are a critical part of teaching and learning in many Indigenous cultures, and I'm not going to fully address that today, but I do have a couple of provocative quotes that I'm just going to let you read, since they're by Indigenous authors, and it doesn't make sense for me as a settler to speak them. But the first one, which is the next slide, is from Tayayake Alfred. So I'll leave that for a second. And then if you can advance to the second one, this one is from Leanne Betamosake Simpson. So two different nations, different parts of the territory currently known as Canada. And I think one thing that's also important to mention here is that when these authors and when other folks talk about land from Indigenous perspectives, it's using the word with an attitude of land being land, water, air, subterranean earth, and all the things that move around or exist as part of that space. So it's not just dirt, which I think as it's often understood in English. So the next slide is just giving you some more sense of land that happens to be important to me. But here I want to talk just about some different possibilities that Tim and I came up with for disrupting interview structure. We did this during the COVID-19 pandemic and also as part of a research study. So there were specific limitations that we faced, but what we decided to do as the sort of fundamental thing was include what's called a medicine walk that would be led by Tim. And again, I'm not going to go into deep information about what a medicine walk is. It's not my place to teach about what a medicine walk is, but I can share my understanding as a non-Indigenous person. And that understanding is really rooted in my own geographic location in Canada or Turtle Island, and draws mostly from Anishinaabe and Cree perspectives. And the way I understand it is that a medicine walk happens, first of all, outdoors, that it's often led by an elder or a knowledge keeper, and that's something that happens either with a group or alone. And when we talk about going on a medicine walk, we're thinking about medicine connecting to notions of health and healing, but not necessarily to sort of Western modes of medicine as some kind of surgical procedure or a drug that you might take, but more about multiple cultural perspectives, things like healing, health, and what does that really mean? What kind of medicines or health or healing are needed in a particular time to find balance and to find well-being. And from my experiences mostly with Tim on medicine walks, that medicine might mean companionship or conversation, sunlight, fresh air, plants, insights, specific teachings, stories, and that those medicines emerge as in response to the walk itself, encounters with things that are found on the land or things that come to mind for the elder that's leading it or participants. So it's really a dynamic process that happens in the moment. So in the case of the medicine walk that we included for our disrupting interview protocol, I followed Tim's guidance about protocol, and so presented him with tobacco as part of my initial request to do the work together, as well as paying him a fee for his services. And we met before the walk to talk about the participants and what they focused on in their interviews. And each participant also presented Tim with tobacco for the medicine walk component. So the next slide should show us a few different structures that we followed. So the one on the far left was the pre-planned version for people who decided not to take the medicine walk. So there were some participants who just did the interview and then a debrief afterwards in a similar manner to what the folks in Calgary were doing. Then some people decided to take that middle path and did the medicine walk in a group setting. And then there ended up being some additional components that were not planned, but that became an important part of the experience. So I've included on the right side of this slide kind of an elaborated, unplanned version of what happened, where participants were given some pre-interview homework. I did an individual interview with them through video conferencing. And then I met with some participants in advance of the medicine walk to talk about how to make a tobacco tie that they would then present to Tim at the start of the walk. And that happened again over a video conference. Then there was the medicine walk itself, where the participants met at a conservation area known by some as Ginnabik Ishpatina and by others as Sheffield Conservation Area. And so we had that group gathering in person on a beautiful fall day. And then after that, a number of the participants said that it was so impactful that they felt the need to debrief as a group. So a number of us met informally for another outdoor walk, not with Tim, but just a casual walk down by Lake Ontario to just talk about what we'd encountered on that day. And then everyone completed an individual written reflection. Everyone reviewed the transcript from their original interview, and we had an individual debrief just with me, again, over video conference. So the next slide talks about, I want to really focus in on the walk because that is the part of my protocol that's different from the Calgary folks and from what Joan's doing in Indiana. But at the same time, I want to be really respectful about not revealing too much of what happened on the walk, because it's my understanding that that would be ethically inappropriate. This was in some ways a really sacred or ceremonial activity, as well as an opportunity for teaching and for growth amongst all of those who went on this walk. So I don't want to share specific details, but I can talk, for instance, about the fact that the walk had a lot of recurring metaphors to do with walking a trail and finding and picking up useful items or ideas. And as I read through transcripts from debriefing interviews, that sort of metaphor of being on the trail returned to my mind, because it seemed like each person who went on the walk took something different away from that experience, something they needed in that moment, and in terms of their own journeys around decolonization and indigenization. And it also provoked some new ideas and explorations, some personal and some professional. So it wasn't necessarily that the interview and the walk were directly linked, but sometimes there was differences or different paths that emerged. It also encouraged participants to move beyond the intellectual space of the original interview, since especially, I think, in an online world where it was really me talking to my computer screen, talking to somebody else, talking to their computer screen, to step from that to an in-person group activity on the land in a pandemic where we were just coming out of a lockdown situation was really strikingly different. And so I think that people responded to that, responded in particular to the kinds of medicine wheel teachings that Tim was sharing around a holistic approach to life that integrates emotional, physical, spiritual, and mental aspects. Really was a striking notion of the impact of the medicine walk in particular. So the next slide, we take a look, and these are the previous slide and this one are both from the location where we were, although not on that day. They also noticed the participants mentioned the value of the walk for experiencing and deepening Indigenous teachings that they felt they lacked. So for myself as a non-Indigenous person, I could share some ideas that I'd gathered over my life in terms of being able to guide them on a journey towards thinking about things in a different way than they were maybe used to. But for the participants being able to learn directly from an Algonquin-Métis traditional knowledge keeper really helped them to understand different Indigenous worldviews that they had never encountered before more deeply, and they really appreciated that. And finally, I think that one of the major points was the notion of the walk as a collective experience became a really important thing, that this was a journey of decolonization and indigenization that, yes, individuals were undertaking and doing a lot of self-exploration, but also there's other people on that journey, and being able to interact with them and share that experience was really important. And I think that the unplanned addition of a tobacco tie making session, and you can see here, these are not the ties from that walk, but some other ones that I've made myself, that really connected to this notion of being together, even as we were apart, that particular session where we were online, working with our hands, talking about things that were in our hearts, became a really powerful moment as well. So if I could get the next slide. This is a quote from my own reflection that I wrote after the medicine walk. And I think it's for me, it's a representation of the way that the medicine walk in particular uncovered the notion of the disrupting interview as not just a researching on situation, but a researching with, where rather than being a researcher separate from participants, observing them or investigating without their participation in some sense, I was with the group, working with the group, and coming to my own realizations as well. And I think that I felt disrupted too within the walk, just as my participants did for maybe different reasons. I felt equally impacted in terms of Tim's teachings on that day. And I think that including that made that more visible to me and made me realize that in the interviews as well, I was becoming impacted by what I was hearing from participants. I would often sort of go lie on the couch after I talked to somebody and just have to absorb what the stories that had been shared. And that kind of processing that happened in me, I think is important to acknowledge as part of this as well. So I think that to sort of sum up, the disrupting interview alone is really valuable. And the participants that I worked with who didn't go on the medicine walk talked a lot about how much it meant to them to do that, to do just the interview. But I think as well, introducing the notion of a medicine walk, introducing the idea of being on the land together and learning from the land was really an important step on the journey, and one that I hope to include in future experiences. So I'll leave you with a few reflection questions on this final slide, and then pass it over to the next.
Okay. Hi, I'm Joan Middendorf, and I'm going to sadly talk about something more in the classroom, more traditional, pedagogical. So I want to, can you go to the next slide, please? I want to talk about how much I was influenced by when I met with, I think I was at an ISSOTL 2019 conference, and I met Lee and Gabe and Michelle, and I went to their session and I learned about disrupting interviews. It really had an influence on me, and I think it improved my work, because previously when I tried to interview people about anything besides their kind of traditional curriculum, they shied away from bottlenecks about whiteness and identity. People avoided these topics, but now with the new questions they gave me, I was able to give them a question that really kind of went straight to the heart of it. And of course, in the United States, we're talking a lot about Black anti-racism or any of the other kinds of identities. But so I would ask them the question, usually we would start out with, what is a bottleneck that upholds racism in your field? And can you go to the next slide, please? And I want to just talk theoretically for a minute about what is the work we're doing here. And as I do this work more and more, I'm learning that it's really important, like the work that Michelle and Gabe and Lee are doing. I spend more and more time on these first two steps where, fundamentally the difference is that this is the problem analysis stage. This is uncovering where the stuck places are and analyzing them and really spending time on the difficulties versus taking action, which is a lot about what Robin and I are talking about. And so the taking action part of decoding the disciplines, and I don't think it comes till a further down slide, is all the parts of the pedagogy that is a part of this theory. Next slide, please. But one thing that I can see that they're doing is that they're really starting from this critical self-reflection. And Kyoko Kishimoto writes that, when you do this work, you have to work through difficult topics productively. And that sounds like, okay, but how do you do it? It needs decoding. And when she goes to give a little bit more detail about that, next slide, please. She says, to work on anti-racist pedagogy, you have to incorporate race and equality in readings. I think people are doing that. And the third one is organize for social change, which gets you to community activism. But the middle part, apply anti-racist and identity pedagogies. That's a part that I think I'm really learning a lot about. And I feel like that's a really important thing to do. Next slide, please. And so these are like steps 3, navigating the problem. Once you find out what is, where are people getting stuck, and what are the problems that are even part of the null curriculum that aren't even there on the table. Now we've brought them out and they're on the table. So I'm kind of looking at what do we do then with it? How do we do something with this? And so this is where I want to show you some ideas for that, because that's where I was able to take their ideas and try to show some of that. So I'm going to show you some things about that. Now, decoding the disciplines, I would say, is it's not, it always looks like it's linear, but it's not. So I'm kind of in this new space trying to do this new work, and I'm trying to do a little bit of all these things at the same time, modeling and getting ways to practice these things and motivating and assessing. I'm trying to do little bits of that all at the same time. But what does that look like? Next slide, please. So I am collecting bottlenecks, and sometimes they look like this. People will say, where they might say, where I was raised, we don't have bias. All we talk about is identity. You're trying to make us feel bad about whiteness and that we have privilege. That's some of the kinds of bottlenecks I'm hearing from students. And then from teachers, they're telling me students can see bias in their textbook, in a textbook sense. They can see it in a case study. They can see it in other people, but they can't see the bias in themselves. And another bottleneck is the inequality of funding of underrepresented people in STEM. So then, okay, so we're finding the bottlenecks, right? We're laying these out on the table. What do we do about them? Next slide, please. So I took that last one, the anti-race to make a lesson. So now we're at the meso level. As Lee was saying, we can work on these things at different levels, but at the meso level, we would want to say if the bottleneck is inequality of funding for underrepresented people in STEM. That is, in the United States, the National Science Foundation gives out funding, but it gives it, and the research shows it gives much less funding to Black and brown people than to white people. Then how do we teach about that? So if the mental move then is to fund Black and brown scientists at equal amounts as their white colleagues, then what would be an analogy? So we could really get students to get this idea really strongly. It's like redlining, which is in the United States, not making home loans in Black neighborhoods. And what the practice, the instructor who actually did a lesson on this was, she had her students critique a research article on diversity on this particular, she had them read an article on this. It was in a biology class where they just typically critique research articles, but suddenly she brought in this article on the uneven funding of people in STEM, and the students really, she was a little nervous to do it because she was going up for promotion that semester. She didn't want negative feedback. And so the students read this article, they critiqued it. And what she found was that students were more engaged than in other discussions for the whole semester. They read the paper more thoroughly. They thanked the teacher for bringing it up in their cell biology class. And it was really cute. She emailed me right. I was like, hey, it went really well. So students like it if you can talk about these topics. I think it helps to have a structure so that they don't just bring their ideology right to the front, but they have a structure for discussing these things. So anyway, that's how you make a lesson on it. You find the topic, you bring it out on the table, and then you have to figure out what kind of thinking you want to help develop. And then you use the rest of the steps of decoding to make the lesson. Let's go to the next slide, please. The next one, please. That's the one we already had. Okay. And so, so one of the things besides collecting bottlenecks, and I just showed you how to deal with one of them, is that I'm collecting methods for modeling and practice. This reminds me of when we were getting people to learn how active learning was important for teaching. We had people had to learn a lot, like, like as a teacher, you'd want to have at least a handful of active learning methods to use in the classroom. Now we want people to have a handful of methods for talking about whiteness and identity in the classroom, or for colonization. And so you want people to have some analogies for something like structural racism. You can look it up. There's an analogy for the fruit and the fence conversation. There's an analogy for bias. It's from the Bible. It's about people have a mote in the eye, which means you can't see your own place you're stuck, but you can see where other people are stuck. And then you want to be collecting methods for discussions about identity and whiteness. There's identity wheels, there's number lines, there's privilege buying games. There's a lot of them, and there'll be more and more over time, but people want to have a handful of these so they can structure these discussions. And then for assessment, you want people to learn a number of assessments, but especially you can see from the work Robin's doing that this has a lot to do with emotions and people's deep inner parts. So what are some assessments that get at emotions? And I'm just going to say one word: CAT, classroom assessment, analogy cats. What's an analogy for bias? Invented dialogues. These are just some of the ones that I find are assessments for helping to get that are better for this kind of work. Next slide, please. And then I just want to say that this is hard work. And so you want to be prepared for resistance along the way. Resistance from students. First of all, listen to the resistance from students when you start doing this work with them. Really listen to them. What are they telling you? I think that's an important place just to acknowledge and be there for. What are the professors who are resistant to this work? What are they telling you? Listen to that resistance, because there's something really important there. And then the next thing is to learn ways to structure these things. I think we need to learn some more structures. And then the other thing is to find your people. And I don't know if that's, people on a committee, or equity allies, friends, mentors, people you can go to when things get bad, because you don't want the bastards to get you down. This is hard work. Okay. And so overall, we're using, what I find is, because it was hard at first to do more of this work and get more pushing on doing this work, it really helped to lean into the parts of this theory, to lean more into doing the deconstructing, into the first two steps, and then to lean into the other parts of the theory. And that was what helped me, instead of just like, I don't know where to begin. Okay, so can we go to the next slide, please? I'm going to leave you with some reflection questions for you. Which things are you working on? Are you working on the interviews, the interventions, the analogies, the discussion methods, the cats? Where are you? And then I think there's one more slide. And I just want to end by saying, for me, this is the most important work we're doing now at Indiana University, and I want everybody to be doing it. I do think we have tools and we have language now, and we're suggesting some for doing this work. And let's get out and do it. Gabe? Did you want
Yes, yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Joan. And also to you, Robin, for your presentation. Really, I'm just so inspired with both of your work. I just wanted to end off as well. Here in Canada, we are experiencing the recovery of mass graves of the Indian residential school children who never made it home. And so we're beginning to reflect more deeply on what is the role of the institution in the genocide of Indigenous people in Canada, and what is that role in decolonizing, and certainly confronting one's own biases and negative assumptions about Indigenous people is not easy work. It's absolutely necessary work, because this is shared healing work. And this is something that isn't just about making lives easier for BIPOC people, but it really is about sharing, healing, engaging on a shared healing journey, and really working together to ensure that the conditions of colonization and racism are confronted and dismantled. So thank you.
And I think that brings us to the close of our presentation, and we have some contact information. We certainly welcome everybody to reach out to us and talk about your work, your thoughts, and if we can work together and answer questions, that'd be great.